um, everyone knows Adrian. You probably don't all know me, so I'll start by introducing myself. So I am Angela Cassidy. I'm an associate professor in science and technology studies. That kind of works. Sometimes I introduce myself as a scholar. I work across STS and the history of science-ish, and look at science policy controversies and normal humans and disease. I also study collaborative practice. And so this is partly the idea behind this session, which, as you've seen in the programme, is quite busy. And the idea was very much, we sat down and we thought, well, in our strand, we run sessions that are grant incubators and a thing called a mashup, which pretty much does what it says on the tin. So we bring together different disciplines, different sets of ideas, stick them together. Sometimes there's a paper, sometimes we do things, sometimes we make mice, whatever. So what we want to do in this session is to kind of give a flavour of how we practice in our strand, rather than talking about our specific research. And so for that reason, we have a fantastic panel, so 5 speakers, who will introduce themselves, because again, part of this is about different voices coming from different places. And what we've asked all of them to do is, oh, thank you. Turn it on. Yeah, I think it's on. Excellent. So what we've asked our panelists to do is to speak for 5 minutes only, on how the idea of the environment or notions of environment come to play in their working lives. And as you'll learn, they all come from very, very different places. And so that's the prompt. We then have a set of discussants from Egenis, who I will introduce. So we have where's Astrid? There. So we have Astrid Strahler, who's a senior lecturer in sociology and philosophy, who does work around microbes and human non-human relations broadly. Yeah. Then we have Hugh Williamson, who is currently a research fellow in the business school, who's worked with Sabina on plant science data and is currently doing some really cool work around livestock and technology. And then finally we have Ollie Moore, who as of very recently was a PhD student working with myself at the Centre for Rural Policy Research, which is my other weird little interdisciplinary home, and is now of Northampton research in the area. And I will embarrass him by saying he's newly passed his Fiverr, and we're very pleased about that. So the 3 of them will essentially respond to the panelists. Adrian and I will say something wise, and if we're really lucky, we might have a few minutes for questions at the end.
I think
that's the plan. Yeah. So at that point, I'm going to invite our panelists to come up and join our line of chairs. No particular order. Please. Okay, and I think we're going to. Do you want to talk about
Yeah, I'll let you know the should we start from the right and move to the left? From the audiences, right? Is it the one?
Yeah,
do you want to take it away, Andrew? Yes.
Lovely. Okay, well, I'm Andy Flack from the University of Bristol. I'm an environmental historian, and I sat thinking about what I might have to say about how environment has featured in my kind of working life. I guess over the course of my career, I guess, kind of falls into 2 kind of particular stages, 2 quite different sets of kind of research projects and different themes and ideas and concepts that I've used to explore the idea of environment. But when I was thinking about those 2, I thought actually they're combined by, or they're linked by 2 key ideas. One is thinking about adaptation, actual adaptation, the materiality of adaptation, but also the discursive world of adaptation, and how that maps onto or emanates from encounters between human and the non-human acting within and as part of a vibrant environment. So my doctoral work was on captive environments, where I worked at Bristol Zoo for several years in their archive, thinking about the adaptation of space to create places in which animals, wild animals in inverted commas, can exist. And the history of this is important in that it shows us that this kind of adaptive agenda is historically contextual. That to begin with, it is simply about providing a place where an animal can survive. There's no great deal of adaptation they have to do. It's simply, how do you preserve this creature in a bear cage to be looked at, either to be looked at by visitors or looked at by people of science to understand how they look and how they behave. Over the course of time, though, that changes as understandings of what an animal is and what an animal needs kind of transforms. And Ollie has written about this in terms of nutrition very recently. And so captive environments were adapted over the course of time to allow encounters between an artificial environment and a captive animal that allowed them not only to survive, but to flourish, to become or to kind of exhibit wild behaviors in a healthy way. So for example, that's by kind of hiding food around the place to enrich and allow animals to forage, to mentally stimulate, to find kind of to find the food they need. Play opportunities in their environments too. This did two things. It's about that encounter, that adaptive encounter between a non-human animal and an artificial environment. But it also, in the process, transforms the encounter between the visitor and the non-human animal on display, because it works from a spectacular point of view too, because it makes the animals mobile, animated, they're doing stuff, they're not sat in a really kind of boring way, right? Most people, when they go to the zoo, are really annoyed because the animal's not doing something. You know, there's expectations there around what an exhibited animal should do. In the same way, my more recent research, the stuff I'm doing now, which is on dark environments and the history of nocturnal natures, is also about adaptation and encounter. And what it's really about is a sensory game. A game between, the participants in that game are the darkness, the dark environment, the kind of the light in the lumosphere, the human being seeking to access that place, and the non-human being that lives in those places. And what we find over the course of time is a really interesting set of adaptations. The human being adapting the body, because of course we're not very good at seeing in the dark. We can adjust, but we can't perfectly see with precision. So adapting the body, using senses beyond the visual to get to know the worlds to which we are strangers. Over the course of time into the 20th century, there is the arrival of new technologies, right, that allow people to do more with their bodies. These are prosthetic technologies. Light in the first instance to illuminate an environment, make it not dark, but also infrared, different type of light, or starlight scopes. Again, harnessing different types of light to allow access to dark natures. This is about adaptation in different ways, adaptation by the body, adaptation through technology. But there's also an important tension that emerges there, which is about the nature of the encounter that is desirable. Is the encounter to be authentic or not? And there's some people who say, you know, from the early 20th century onwards, an authentic encounter is about getting to the reality of what's going on. And we can use technologies to do that. And there are others who say, well, actually, authenticity is about rejecting technology, using only our body to to generate a more intimate and proximal encounter with what may or may not be there. Part of this conversation is understanding the adaptations that non-human animals have to, and that's where the sensory game comes in, because actually it's about adapting human body in relation to what people are understanding the non-human body to be doing. And that is quite significant, I think. And then the final thing to say on that is the material consequences of these processes of adaptation, which is not only perhaps that more and more natural scientists have been able to access dark places in different ways, but also in doing so, they have changed, they have adapted the environment, either by casting light into it or simply by being present. And that has then led to non-human animals in those places adapting to a changed environment. So what emerges is these dynamic dark places that are fluid and always changing in relation to these kind of sensory maneuvers that are taking place. Yeah, that's my thing.
Hi everyone, so my name is Rose Traps. I am a postdoc here in philosophy of biology. I work together with Sabina on her project on philosophy of open science, and I will soon be moving to the University of Bergen, where I'll be working on citizen science. So I've prepared a little talk because I've been so busy, or I knew I would be busy at this conference, so I had no headspace. The main point I want to get across today is that environments are relational. Environments are for certain organisms and for them in specific ways. And I think that already came out in what Andy was talking about. So I'm most familiar with the concept of niche. Niches are first and foremost those little alcoves on walls that statues go in. But at the turn of the last century, just as ecology was emerging as a discipline, some ecologists started using the term to refer to the roles or requirements of species in ecological communities. Since then, the niche has become a common, if contested, concept in ecology. It's also traveled to many other disciplines, from evolutionary biology and cognitive science to sustainability science and business studies. In each of these disciplinary contexts, the term niche means slightly different things, even just in ecology. The ecological niche most frequently gets defined as the conditions required for a population to persist, the survival aspect, but also potentially flourishing. So there's certain sorts of food, certain temperature ranges, some amount of water or light, places to lay eggs. All of these sorts of things go into defining an ecological niche as the conditions that a species requires or a population requires in order to keep doing what it's doing. But there's also different concepts of the ecological niche, such as the functional role of a species in an ecological community, which focuses in on things to do with the place a species occupies in a food web, for instance. Looking beyond ecology, things get even more complicated. In evolutionary biology, the niche gets defined in terms of selection pressures that a population experiences and the way they influence those selection pressures through, say, niche construction. In cognitive science, the niche gets used in relation to the sorts of things out there that we need for thinking and doing. So a wide variety of ways to think about niches, let alone environments. And something that brings all of these different ways of thinking about niches together is that they all define niches in relation to particular organisms. It's the needs, activities, and experiences of organisms that determine what factors or features count as part of their niches. For instance, there being plankton of a certain size or type might be in the niche of one species of jellyfish, but not another. I actually looked this up, jellyfish eat plankton. And that's because each species focuses on and consumes different sorts of food resources. This means that niches are relational. Niches are for certain organisms and for them in certain ways. I think the relationality of niches likely carries over to other conceptualizations of environments more broadly. And more generally, I think that looking at relationality can lead to some interesting insights. First, there's the environments we ourselves experience as researchers, research environments. This is something Sabina Leonelli and I have been working on. So universities and funders talk about the importance of having a good research environment, but this is also a concept that can work for us to make sense of, to think about, and to work on the sorts of conditions that research is undertaken within, and the sorts of conditions that researchers experience throughout their careers. So, for instance, we've been considering how the niche concept can help to draw out these multidimensional enabling conditions for research. And we're also looking at how researchers have to navigate many different sets of interests and demands throughout their careers, especially in transdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary research. We're using the term research multiplex to get at these sorts of complex, manifold, and conflict-ridden environments that researchers operate in today. A second area where relationality might have some interesting implications is in environmental ethics and politics. We often talk in terms of the environment, one environment that we are all destroying and that we should all take care of. But if we take relationality seriously, this just can't be the case. In debates about climate change and the Anthropocene, there's been many discussions about how different groups of people are differentially responsible, at risk, and able to act. And I think recognizing on and drawing on relationality can help us to see that there are many different environments and different environments for different groups and for different purposes or ways of distinguishing them. Alternative understandings, of course, might emphasize more entanglement or processes in ways that disrupt this distinction that relationality relies on. Nevertheless, I think there's something to be said for the dependencies and differences that relationality allows us to recognize and work through.
Right, just got to get my top switched off. So my name is Sam Scribb, and I am the Principal Officer for World Heritage with the Jurassic Coast Trust. And I work on the Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site, as you might imagine. Hang on. Exactly that. So I'm not an academic or a practicing scientist at all. My whole career has been spent on the Jurassic Coast, really working with geology and paleontology and geomorphology and trying to convince people that that's interesting. From 10-year-olds, when I started down at Charmouth, taking kids out fossil hunting, right through to planners and environment agency officers and stuff like that today. And I prefer to speak spontaneously and just sort of off the cuff, if you like, otherwise known as winging it. But I found the question quite confronting in a good way and sort of difficult in its simplicity. So I had to really think about it. And I took a bit of a literal approach and just thought, okay, what does it feel like to do my job then? And I had to write it down in order to articulate it properly. So like Rose, I'm just going to have to read it to you. So I work in the nature conservation sector, and I'm involved with interpreting nature as heritage. And with providing advice on policy and decision making, all in relation to a geological World Heritage Site. I'm a geologist by background, but definitely not a practicing scientist. All of that is sort of comes with this really lofty political notion of outstanding universal value, by the way, which sounds like a label of this is a really important place, but is actually, if you look into it, a political project by UNESCO to build bridges between nations and so on. I won't try to explain it because I'll take the rest of my 5 minutes. For me, professionally, environment more often than not corresponds to nature. We use terms like the quality of the environment, which usually depends on the condition of the natural features of an area, their beauty, their scientific importance, etc. So a high density of protected natural sites in good condition in an area, you'd say that was a high quality environment. It is a value judgment. But my observation has been after many years that the environment is a finite thing onto which we project more values, meanings, and functions than it can accommodate. So in practice, the environment is a contested space, and a tremendous amount of money and time is spent by society in negotiating a way out of that. to decide how an environment should be used and what parts of its fundamental nature are most important in that given time, I suppose. It can be combative and over any and all issues, from coastal development to the right of access to the countryside. And my work takes me into the thick of that in lots of different contexts, but in each one, I am making the case that geodiversity should be given fair account. But I have this other version of the environment, one that in a sense doesn't exist anymore, and that can feel like a refuge from all that human clutter. And that other environment for me is the geological past. I am required to constantly think about and resurrect for myself and others Triassic deserts, Jurassic seas, Cretaceous swamps and forests. To be able to do my job, I have to know in my bones why it matters anyone thinks about these things at all, and therefore why we need to protect what remains of these long vanished environments in today's rocks and fossils. It's a cliche, but working mentally in the scale of millions of years and profound global change has skewed my perspective on the present, on our current environment and our relationship with it. I wouldn't say that it's made me a cynic, but it has certainly been an antidote to the notion of human exceptionalism, which tends to be a bit of an undercurrent with a lot of the audiences that we communicate with, certainly sort of unconsciously, if you like. So, environment then, for me, it's a place where the past and the present exist in the same place at the same time, physically in the fabric of the landscape, but also inside people's heads. It also means arguing over whose version of that place should take precedence. Trying to work with all that, make sense of it, is really what keeps me doing what I do professionally. It's hard work, but it's definitely not boring. Thank you.
I feel like it'll be not boring now. So I'm Melanie Smallman, and I guess I'm a sociologist. I'm in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at UCL. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been just a really interesting few days. I want to make 4 points in 5 minutes, so I think I can do that. So before becoming an academic was something like a midlife crisis for me. Before that, I had almost 20-year career as a science communicator and as a policy person. So I spent, before doing my PhD, I spent the 8 years before that as an advisor to the chief scientist in the UK government Environment Department, DEFRA. And so I never really thought about how we thought about the environment as communicators and policymakers, but in sort of reflecting on that this week, I think that we certainly talked about it as a topic or an issue, but with the advent of the Stern Review and ideas around low carbon economies, suddenly there was a shift while I worked in government, and that we suddenly started talking about the environment very much as a resource. So that was something I thought about, while I was there. In my academic work, I started off, and I kind of still am, I guess, interested in public conceptions of science and technology, so how people think about when they encounter new science and technologies. And I use a big data approach and a computational approach to look across. So while some of my colleagues study public attitudes of GM, I study public attitudes to everything. And by taking this sort of helicopter view, and by nature, it's comparative. So I'm constantly looking at how attitudes to GM compared to attitudes to synthetic biology, to computers and this kind of thing. And in the course of that, one of the things that has come out quite strongly, firstly, other people have said that ideas around nature and the environment and naturalness drive public attitudes to technology. So people like Martin Bauer and George Gaskell have done work around this on GM. But by looking across topics and topics side by side, what's become really clear to me is that people do use nature as kind of a yardstick to make decisions and to form views on new technologies. But there's different conceptions of nature and naturalness that they use, which depends on certain features of the technology. So the sort of 3 conceptions that I have described is, firstly, when people are talking about things like GM food and GM crops, they talk about nature or naturalness as a state. So something is either natural or it's not, and if it's not, it's bad. Secondly, when it comes to technologies in sort of categories like synthetic biology or geoengineering, things which are kind of out there in the world, a bit more remote than human contact, they talk about the nature and naturalness. I've called it ecological, but I guess it's a process or a system. So the idea of nature as a system in balance. And the question is, does this technology interfere with that balance? If it does, it's bad because there's going to be consequences, because this is a finely balanced system that we mustn't mess with. And then lastly, when it comes to human genetics and these kind of reproductive technologies that really do touch upon questions of what it is to be human, nature and naturalness is seen as a law, and a law that must never be broken without there being dire consequences. So quite religious ideas around lines that must not be crossed and things which must not be done. So, you know, these three very public conceptions of nature that are kind of, well, not kind of, they are guiding how people start to think about new technologies and new science as they first encounter it. So then, more recently, as a result, there's a very long story, but the short version is that as a result of using computational techniques, I've accidentally got involved with thinking about data ethics and AI ethics, and trying to... so I think current accounts of AI ethics tend to be quite flat. So I've been doing work over the last 5 years to give perhaps more topography, which I guess I've just realized is an environmental term as well. So to give more topography to ideas around data ethics and AI ethics. And I've been thinking about scale as a way to bring in other disciplines. So as a sociologist looking at this, I'm like, why aren't you talking about institutions? Why aren't you talking about communities? So to extend thinking around ethics from thinking about the relationship between technology and the individual to thinking about communities, societies, economies, and so on, which I think touches upon some of what Rose was saying. But in that context, we've been working around ideas about the environment as a scale in terms of time and thinking about intergenerational fairness and those kind of issues. So that's quite a strange thing of conflating environment and time and scale, but that's what we're doing there at the moment. And then I guess lastly, and to some extent this is kind of a superficial comment, but also for me possibly one of the most important comments, is that, so I'm on sabbatical at the moment and I'm spending time thinking about what am I going to do when I go back to university, and why am I going to go back, and what's the point of all of this? And I think that, you know, we don't have to look far to realise that the world's on fire and that the flames are at our feet. And for me, going back as an academic has to be strictly on the understanding that I have to do something about the environmental problems facing us as a planet in the way that I was trying to do when I worked in government as a policymaker. So my last point is that for me, the environment and the climate crisis is increasingly the most important motivation for turning up to work each morning and actually doing something so we can continue to live here.
Hi, I'm Arwen Nicholson and I work here in Exeter University. I'm a postdoctoral in the astrophysics department, more specifically the exoplanet theory group. Right, I'm going to wing it, so I'm just going to keep an eye on the time. But so in the exoplanet theory group, many people, Nathan, Maid and others, have taken the software that the Met Office used to predict the weather, and they've applied it to different planetary scenarios. So they've got a model for early Earth, I think it's from about 3.5 billion years ago, for Mars, and for other objects, some more exotic, known as hot Jupiters, called that because they're Jupiter-sized and they're really hot because they're close to their sun. And these models can give us an idea of what conditions are like on these planets. So surface temperatures, cloud coverage, wind speeds, and all this kind of thing. And I'm a part of this group, but my part is to take the terrestrial models, and I've mostly done this so far for early Earth, and to add some life to see how that impacts the planet, how that changes things. So in my research, I'm really looking at environment on the planetary scale. What does a planet with life look like? And I do that because I'm interested in the search for biosignatures, so signs of life on distant planets. Because now we have the telescope technology that astronomers can actually peer into the atmospheres of distant worlds, and they can start to see what they're made of, what chemicals are there. And now that we can do that, we can start to look for signs of life. So it's no longer science fiction. In the coming decades, it's possible that there could be, some evidence for an inhabited world. But we need to know what we're looking for, because it turns out it's really complicated. So on Earth, the oxygen we're breathing, this is a product of life. There's a huge diversity of planets out in the galaxy, and under different planetary scenarios, an atmosphere can actually fill with oxygen with no life needed at all. So it wouldn't be enough to look into an atmosphere and find oxygen and say, oh, cool, we found life. There could be many things going on. So we're going to need multiple lines of evidence, all pointing towards this planet as being an inhabited planet shaped by life. And so, as the only planet we know of with life, we turn to Earth and what we know of our own planet to try and understand what we might expect out there. And looking at Earth, we see, it's been around about 4.5 billion years, and it's been inhabited for about 4 billion of those years, and it's been dramatically transformed by life over that time. So the earlier, about 4 billion years ago, when our earliest ancestors were living in the ocean, was a very different world. There wasn't land for us to stand on, no oxygen for us to breathe. It would have looked very different too. We think that the atmosphere, the sky would have been hazy and orange, and the oceans would have been green because of the different chemistry on the surface of our planet at that time. And then over time, life has played an enormous role in transforming our planet into the world that we depend on, the one that we're adapted to. And life is involved in these numerous feedbacks that regulate the ocean chemistry, the atmosphere chemistry, and the climate of our planet. And models predict that if Earth had no life, it would be much hotter than it is today, perhaps up to about 45 degrees Celsius hotter, which is an enormous difference. So I, as part of my research and others at the Exoplanet group, we're trying to understand our own planet as as a living planet, and how it's been transformed so that we can apply it to any other planet we find, so that we have this proper planetary context to put any signature like oxygen into the proper context, so we can actually say whether or not we think we found life. And by looking for life out in the galaxy, it sort of brings us back home. It makes us consider our own planet. And I think it puts our perspective, of ourselves into sort of context. There's sometimes this train of thought that if we find an inhabited world or a habitable planet, that maybe we could go there and we could live there. But I think that's very unlikely, because you can't, we haven't just kind of appeared at the end of Earth's story. We're a part of the ongoing co-evolution of our planet with life. And you can't separate humanity from our environment, right? We're just so dependent on it. And any other living planet out there that we might find is going to have a similarly deep, relationship of co-evolution with life on it. And I don't think we can expect to kind of show up and expect a warm welcome. And, things like the COVID pandemic showed us even, new pathogens here close to home. We're very, very susceptible. We're a very needy species. So I think it kind of helps, put that into context. We're looking for these inhabited planets because, it's cool. It'd be amazing to find life out there. But it's not the same as looking for, planet B. There isn't one. So I think we always need to keep that in mind when we're doing this work.
I now take on the delightful role of microphone passer, backer, and forwarder between the discussants and the panelists.
Okay, thank you. That was a wonderful, rich, and diverse account of different kinds of environments. And I think I understand my role, that I'm supposed to poke you with questions and make you talk to each other about your different kinds of concepts of environment. And I want to start with where Melanie ended with the problems of environment. And the first question that comes to mind, how do you see how in your specific field, the definition of environments related to problems? Andy talked about adaptational environment. How do we know, or how do you know when adaptation fails? When is there something going wrong? Right? How do you stabilize what is, or how do you know when something is stable enough that there's an adaptation happening? Right? Rose talked about many environments, so environments for organisms, niches for organisms. How do you think, is there a different problem if you think about environmental problem? And you said there is not the environment, right? There are little local environments for different kinds of organisms. How do you think about environmental problems in that case? Sam was talking about geological past and present happening at the same time. How do you bring what is, maybe it's a question here, the significance of the past in order to articulate environmental problems in your case? Melanie talked about very different kind of resources and balances. So yeah, the question would be, when is something out of balance? But how do you know, how do you assess that? And but you made me think of the oxygen holocaust of early, the creation of the atmosphere by the cyanobacteria, right? So there's a moment in which, lots of things got out of balance and new things happened, right? So, and thinking on a completely different kind of scale in your work, like how do you figure environmental problems there? So maybe
There's a battery of questions.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, I think your question to me really emphasizes that whether something or not is a problem depends on who you are, and what kind of scale you're looking at. Because you mentioned the great oxidation event. So we went from, well, Earth went from a atmosphere where there was no oxygen. And then about 2.5 billion years ago, oxygen dramatically rose, not to the level we have today, but it was still an enormous change on our planet. And oxygen is really poisonous. If you're not adapted to it, that's a really bad thing. So it would have been pretty bad for life at the time. So from that point of view, I mean, that's a catastrophe. You've poisoned your entire planet. You've changed the surface chemistry of your world. But if that had never happened, we couldn't be here because we need oxygen. You wouldn't get complex life and all of the life forms, and you wouldn't get us unless that had happened. So it depends on who you are. It depends on when you're looking at, because it's in our history, because it's a part of the story that led to us. It's obviously, for our point of view, it's a good thing. As life did adapt and new things came along. And that's kind of the story of Earth history. It does have these periods of disruption. For life at that time, that's usually a pretty bad thing. A lot of species go extinct. I think dinosaurs is probably the most well-known one. But then after that, new things come. So after the dinosaurs kind of cleared the way, mammals who were already there, changed. They became bigger and became to dominate spaces that dinosaurs took up. So that kind of puts our current activities into context, that if you were just a dispassionate observer of Earth history, you could just say, oh, okay, this is just another transformation. If they wipe themselves out, something new will come along. And I do think that. I do think, if we really mess up, Earth will be fine, the biosphere will bounce back. But obviously I'm a human, right? So it really matters. And we won't just take ourselves out, we'll take a lot of other things out. So from that point of view, it really does matter, because this is our home, we need it. So yeah, sometimes in science, I think because we're looking at the graphs, we're looking at the data, you can kind of think of yourselves as separated from it, but we're not. We're embedded in this story. So yeah.
As we're having this is basically a very awkward conversation. So you don't have to all say something. Say something if you wish to.
I mean, I was just going to say something. You asked me about how do we know when the system, or how do I know? It's not, I'm saying that the public think this is not what I think. So their view is that the system is out of balance. So it's very much this downfall of man narrative. that the world was pristine in the days of the Garden of Eden, and everything we've done ever since has taken us further away from that. Which, you know, in my work, I find quite interesting because it clashes with the sort of scientists' story, which is that humans can fix everything, science is going to solve all our problems, and when it goes wrong, it's just by accident, and we just need to know more and do more. So yeah, it's not me, it's what other people think. And I mean, the stuff I'm writing at the moment is explaining how these two ideas are coming up against each other and causing conflict and tension, when actually they maybe are misunderstandings rather than.
Oh God, so much to think about. So the significance of the geological past, how do we bring that into, well, I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it, but there's two things. I mean, what you were saying was exactly what I was going to say, actually. One of the questions we get when we go out, imagine we go out to talk to a group of people, but could be a Probus group or, you know, Rotary group or something like that, about the Jurassic Coast and all the environmental changes that it represents through geological time. One of the questions we might get at the end, well, if it's always been changing, why do we have to worry about it now? About climate change, but it's a bit cold comfort. The reason you said, well, there's no guarantee that we as a species are going to survive that extinction. And one of the ideas with the dinosaurs is the reason that they suffered when the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous happened is because they had become so specialized. We're pretty specialized. We tend to think of ourselves as very generalists and able to adapt, but you know, our entire civilization has come about in a very, very stable, unusually stable period of Earth's climatic history. You know, you have to go back a few million years to see sea levels that were 200 meters higher than they are today, a condition of Earth where there was no ice at all at the caps, and all sorts of different things like that. So looking at the geological past is not exactly a source of comfort, I don't think. There's a lot, we should be kind of really learning the lessons that, you know, it could easily, very easily happen to us, because it has happened to the vast majority of all species previous to us have gone extinct. So it's inevitable that we'll go extinct as well. So apart from the kind of ground geological stories, which can be quite sort of conceptual in their basis, it's okay, well, what about the places where that significance is expressed tangibly? So in the cliff faces that we protect because of the evidence they contain. And that becomes much more sort of localized in how people think about them, because they will be thinking about those places and all the other reasons that they matter. So because of their aesthetics, because they're somewhere they walk their dog, because they're somewhere dangerous, because the cliff's falling down. And the designations and the evidence for the geology that we might want to protect its naturalness is a barrier, because they want to stop that stuff from happening, or they want to do something different with it, so it becomes a problem. And so their valuing of the significance of geology goes out the window, because they're valuing something else much more, even though it is a crucial source of evidence for us to cope with what's to come. And the other thing that it connects to really deeply for me is adaptation on the coast, because people's willingness to face up to the need to adapt is, well, can be quite depressing, put it that way. And even to the point where that question of naturalness comes up. So we get challenged sometimes where we say things like, okay, well, the natural processes along the coastline are what maintain access to all the geology and the fossils. And so that's what we need to embrace, the natural processes of change. And lately people have been saying, well, with human influence in climate change, we can't call it natural anymore. So it's almost giving them license to not have to adapt, because, well, it's not natural, so we can do whatever we want with it. But again, it doesn't kind of reflect the reality that change is happening and we cannot stop it entirely. So we have to adapt. But people are incredibly resistant to
that. Okay, so you asked me how we know if adaptation has gone wrong. Well, if adaptation is essentially about the coherence between a body and the environment in which it lives, then we can identify moments where there's slippage there, where that coherence is not quite right. And the most obvious signal of that is death. So extinction at a species level is where, you know, something has changed in the environment in some way, and the body of the species no longer fits necessarily. But also in the individual sense too, in a captive environment, artificial environment, the animal dies, and it may well die the same kind of specimens of the same species may die over and over again, and that is a signal that the captive space is not quite right. Less severe perhaps is ill health, in terms of an animal not thriving either in its wild environment or its artificial space. So I think there are kind of objective ways to measure maladaptation, but also I think history shows us that it's a matter of perspective too, in that different individuals in different places, different times, have different understandings of what their own ability to adapt is in any place and time. And you know, we're talking a lot at the species level with the human being, but within that species level, there is enormous diversity, different levels of ability, etc., etc. And adaptation means different things in different times and places. And there's a warning in there too. And because adaptation is a matter of perspective, there are multiple instances in history where natural scientists have got it wrong. They've not understood quite how a particular animal is adapted to its environment, and that then leads to interventions that don't work. So the warning from history is to think very carefully, and not to assume that we understand what precise adaptations an animal has and what it needs.
I can just add a couple of things, because I noticed that we're focusing a lot on adaptation, but there's also this element of like making changes to the environment to potentially make it better for us, like you were talking about with coastal adaptation or not. And I think that's important to recognize that there's various different responses that organisms can make, or various different ways that they can interact with their environments. It's not just adaptation, it's also selectively consuming different sorts of resources, or relocating, or these sorts of things, or making physical changes to the environment, whether it's building walls or eating things. So I think that's important to recognize as well, that even if there might be problematic elements to the relationship between an organism and its environment, there's very different ways to respond to that and to act on that. And sometimes that creates further problems, obviously, like intervening on the environment, and it just becomes worse and worse and worse. That does happen, even amongst non-human animals. But sometimes it's for the better as well. So, yeah.
Yes, go on.
Thank you all. That was really very interesting. I was intrigued that we kind of went from Bristol Zoo to other planets, and it kind of grew, clearly by design. What I was interested with that is how do we draw, and this is leaning on my experience of my PhD being in an interdisciplinary project and moving into what is now a transdisciplinary project. How do we draw research on the environment together to sort of create the change that needs to happen, and kind of open to whoever?
Well, can I just ask what you mean by change? What the change that we need to happen?
I think in regards to how humans are engaging with environment, so I'm going to use the word nature, natural, but obviously that is contested in itself. This kind of issue of, you know, the climate crisis that we have, I think, how do we learn from the history to, you know, potentially what else is happening in our universe?
Okay, so my response to this is going to sound super cynical. But I think there's a real barrier there at the point at which you are trying to reach people, ordinary people, if you like. So over my career, I have seen multiple projects by very well-meaning organizations of different types to work with the problem around adaptation. So how do you work with communities to get the message across of necessary adaptation through scenario planning, through thinking about the power dynamics in the relationships within those different groups with the experts, and translating technical jargon and all of that good stuff. And they're all brilliant, and they all tend to come up with the same answers, but it's at the point of application and replication of those. So actually, I think we know what we need to do, and the research is already there to support it all already, and everybody's already working with that interdisciplinary approach of recognizing that you need psychology, sociology, history, in environmental scientists, technical experts, coastal scientists, all of those kinds of things, whatever they might be, they all need to be drawn in to come up with what the discourse should be about. But there is some barrier and the resistance, like I said, where it's like I don't know, a nettle that nobody's being willing to grasp fully. So I don't see the problem as the interdisciplinarity of it, or just the fact of when it comes to the application, nobody has cracked how to actually make it stick.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but no. So, yeah, people keep saying to me, we've got all of the answers, but we're not doing it. So we don't have the answers, right? So the answers, the good answers, are going to be the ones that stick. And there is a job to be done understanding why these are not sticking and what we need. So, you know, people don't want to do certain stuff. And I mean, I spent last year talking to local government leaders about their citizens' assemblies. And the reason that they're having these citizens' assemblies is because the local government leaders know what they've got to do, and they're not prepared to tell people that that's what they have to do. They don't feel they've got a political mandate to say, you have to stop driving cars, we have to have 20-mile-an-hour zones, we have to have ultra-low emission zones in London, right? We've seen what happens. There is not the political mandate to do that, and that means there isn't the public appetite to do that. So there is work, I think, to be done to understand why people don't want to do that, or to find other solutions which are more palatable, and to support people with what we know about participatory methods to try and involve people. But I think that as academics, it requires a kind of change in register in how we think about ourselves and what we do. I know that we've had conversations in UCL about the line between being an academic and being an activist. You know, I don't quite understand why people are concerned about that. More recently, conversations about whether we should bid for some money from one of the Research Council's low carbon technology grants, and what we would do. And the idea was that we'd have a series of workshops with managers from across whatever. And I said, we've got, you know, almost £1 million here. Why don't we buy some solar panels and work with communities to put them on the roofs? You know, it was more sophisticated than that. But the point being that if we've got all of this research money, can we not use some of it to make a difference and to study how you make a difference, you know, rather than have a workshop to talk about how to make a difference? So I think that we know some stuff, there's some stuff we don't know, and I think we just need to roll our sleeves up and think how we can use our intellect to help people in a practical way as well.
Sorry.
Okay, so I think there's several, I mean, I agree with all these points, absolutely. I mean, I think, frankly, a centre like this is one step towards working in an interdisciplinary way, but it always has to be, I think, more than simply sharing ideas. It's about developing a shared language and a shared toolkit that allows the next step, which is about bringing those disparate perspectives and approaches into a generative conversation. Also think co-creation, so kind of going to communities first and building research from the ground up, so it's responding to people as they understand their own needs. I think that's the only way to begin to bring about change. I'm not kind of imposing a set of ideas that may be rejected too easily. However, I think time matters in two senses of the word here, because this requires potentially a long period of time. And do we have that time to be doing all that groundwork? We need to act quite fast now, but also time as academics working in burdensome bureaucracies where we're overworked. Right? We also need to be untethered to allow us the time to go out and have nice conversations with people, to work out what they want. And unfortunately, I think time is a great constraint on our capacity to do these things.
Yeah, I guess like from the actual research I do look at like the planetary scale, if you're putting something into the atmosphere, you want to be taking it out, right? It's like a feedback loop, and we've broken that feedback loop. So what to do is, you know, on that hand, pretty simple. And sometimes you see people suggest strange things like shooting mirrors up into space, like reflect the sun. And I mean, that just seems like a really bad idea, because the Earth system's really, really complex. And, you know, for example, carbon dioxide dissolves better in cold water, right? So what happens if you have lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? you know, affected by the sun, all these things, all these knock-on effects. So I'm not a big fan of any kind of techie geoengineering thing. It feels a bit like, you know, you're just going to keep adding on problems and problems. And what if it breaks, right? Then you have a catastrophic change. So from that side, it seems simple. And then I guess, like, you know, we've heard a bit about, like, you know, public and getting people engaged. This isn't really my research, but you were talking about the boundary between, you know, academia and activism. Like, I definitely think that in order for people to care, they need to have access to our natural world, or the world. And, you know, the UK is largely owned and private, and we're not allowed to access it. So it's a lot to ask people, you know, it's like, why should they care if something's going, if they've never seen it? Or, like, you know, we used to have rainforests, there's still little pockets of rainforests. Like, a lot of people don't know that we had that. And there's all of this, like, wonderful stuff to protect, but we can't get to it because it's all behind a fence. So I think, you know, some of that we have to rethink how we have a relationship with our world and how we see ourselves as a part of our natural environment, you know, because sometimes it's like, oh, we shouldn't go there because we'll wreck it. It's like the last bit of something. And if we go there, or if people know, it will be ruined. But then, you know, then we want to ask people, oh, but we have to defend it. And it's like, well, they don't know anything about it. Why would you care if you never see it? So I do think we need to kind of be integrating ourselves more and, you know, trusting that we can have, you know, this relationship with land without destroying it. You know, we can be a positive, you know, force. And I think we do need to rebuild that kind of relationship and see ourselves in a more positive light. So it doesn't all have to be horrible.
I'm sorry. Collaboration.
Thank you, everyone. That's a really interesting and diverse set of reflections on the meaning of environment in all of your own work. And what it got me thinking about was how over the last century, we've had a lot of, well, proliferation really of different understandings of what environments are through science, through other kinds of knowledge. But alongside that, there's also been a substantial amount of work of advocacy around environments, understanding, well, in this case, think of advocacy as a case of speaking for environments, whether that's the environments themselves or organisms in environments, people, non-humans, and then more recently shifting from a kind of a speaking for model to the ways that Jane was talking about yesterday, with more of a speaking with, perhaps. And I thought this theme came out through all of your talks in different ways, and then what you've been saying since. So in Andy's case, you can see advocacy lurking in the background, particularly around captive animals, the work to speak for particular understandings of what it means for them to be in wild environments, and then the translation of that into substantial change in zoos or other captive environments. Rose, your conceptual characterization of environments is very similar to what a lot of advocates do, the relational understanding of an organism and an environment, as opposed to the environment just being some sort of universal condition that would erase the politics, being able to articulate understandings that do bring up the specificity of what people experience and how they relate and where we might need to take that in political terms. And then Sam, in your own work, you've clearly been doing advocacy around understanding the Jurassic Coast environment in particular ways, and then engaging with the politics of that at both a local level, a community level, a political funding level. Melanie, in your case, there were several different dimensions in which advocacy and speaking out comes up, both in terms of your work in governance. There's a clear relationship there between how environments get understood, as you said, the kind of resource understanding, and how that articulates with both the policy creation and then the communities who interact with policies, but also the diverse ways that people in the world think about environments and have these motivations for engaging with environment in a particular way. And then Arwen, in your case, and as you were just getting at now, I think the question of advocacy for our own understanding of ourselves on this planet seems to lurk in the background very strongly. So I wondered whether this is an open question to any and all of you, just to reflect a bit more about the relationship between the meanings of environment that you've talked about and the work of advocacy, whether it's by yourselves or by your research subjects or others, as kind of a provocation to see where you think that is now and where you think it might be a good place to go, and how we, as experts of various kinds, can contribute to that.
Just pass it, you guys can pass it between each other.
Okay. Well, I can certainly. Okay, there's a couple of ways I think I can answer this. So, first, from the context of what I found in my research, which is a couple of individuals for whom being an advocate for nocturnal animals was completely about rejecting technology and becoming nocturnal themselves. So about immersion in particular dark environments. So there's one woman called Chris Ferris. That's not her real name; it's a pseudonym. She spent 5 years pretty much every night going out into the dark places around her home, and in doing so, she learned the kind of the animal highways and byways that the animals used in the woods and across the meadows and the fields. She was able to develop and adapt her body to be able to watch and be with these creatures without disturbing them. Well, that's what she says. I am slightly concerned that there was probably a degree of habituation that went on. But nonetheless, she felt that by getting as close as she could, by changing her body in its purest way, that was advocacy. That was about knowing them in a way that science couldn't know them, or rather technological science couldn't. And then from my perspective, as an advocate and an activist, my activism in terms of my work at the zoo was simply about telling a story that tried to kind of get into the muddy waters of what a zoo is, whether it's good, whether it's bad. It's always polarized. You never find people really in the middle. But actually, the truth of the matter is somewhere in the middle, and it's complicated. So that was my form of kind of advocacy. And then with my dark kind of work now, my night studies, my advocacy, I suppose, is more at a kind of disciplinary level, speaking to the life sciences, in the problem is that still very little is known about dark natures. Very simply, that's because we are creatures of the light, and we don't know necessarily how to go into kind of dark places to understand the way their ecologies work. My work is to try and understand a bit more and tell that story of how people have tried to do it, and to make the case for the enchantment, the wonder of darkness at our feet, not just darkness in the sky.
So this didn't really come out in what I was talking about, but just this question made me start to think about it. So ecologists, the ecologists that I've interacted with at least, care a lot about their organisms and the places where they work, the spaces where they work, and where their organisms live. And you see this interesting tension where they've got these very abstract understandings like niche, where you can break it down into dimensions and you can plot with what sorts, how much of each type, of each size of resource each organism is consuming. And you can do all of this work at the same time. There's like this growing concern amongst ecologists that this sort of analytic work just isn't going to help them preserve the places and the organisms that they're studying. So this relationship that they have with, especially if they've done field work, with the organisms and with their environments, is something that's, like, obviously it's important for them to be able to carry out their research, but it's also important to them as something that they care about. And I'm like, I don't have a solution to this, obviously, but I think it's quite an interesting thing that you see ecologists starting to wonder if they maybe should spend less time doing this formalized observational or experimental science, and potentially more time doing more sort of co-creation stuff with local communities, or talking to governments and doing advocacy for the places that they care about. So I think it's something quite interesting that there could be a tension potentially that ecologists are facing there. Yeah.
So most of my advocacy occurs through the discipline of heritage interpretation, which is its own thing. And sort of came out of the work by a chap called Freeman Tilden, who was working in the national parks in America in the 50s, I think. He wrote a book called Interpreting Our Heritage, which has a series of principles in it, which are quite poetic in the way they're expressed, and ambitious. Got to relate to the whole human and things like that. It's really nice. Sometimes it's sort of summarized as the idea to provoke, relate, and reveal new things. So it's stories, and ultimately that have got to be relevant to humanity and your audience. But it's challenging because there are also statistics like you have literally something like 3 seconds to get somebody's attention. And if you don't have their attention in 3 seconds, they'll go on and look at something else. So when you're trying to advocate for stuff, you've got to bear in mind very much the appetites of your audience, that you're talking, the people you're talking to. You can't just expect them to want to listen to you if you've got nothing interesting to say, or you're not saying it in an interesting way, at least. And a lot of my own professional interest has been taken up wrangling with, okay, how do you then make geology and geological heritage stuff that happened outside of any human frame of reference of time, outside of the existence of humanity as a species, so and places that you can't go anymore. So I can't take people to the Triassic Desert and say, see, isn't it lovely and important? And look at all these lovely things we can learn from it. No, I'm asking them to imagine it. So advocacy for me, I'm interested in the ideas of how geology connects with people's own sense of identity. And that is derived from the way geology influences place and its characteristics, the opportunities that have existed there, how life has responded to that, and therefore how human history has responded to that. So, for example, something like Beer in East Devon, there is a lovely chalk stream there. There's also flint out of the chalk. Beer flint has been found around the southwest in Neolithic and I think Mesolithic tool use. So it's obviously been traded out of that place. It's a lovely clear stream, so people have settled there, you can drink the water. And then from that, human history evolves, and there's fishermen there and all sorts of, there's stuff. Anyway, so place identity and therefore individual identity, I think is really interesting. But also, I quite like the idea of our own agency when it comes to the geological past as heritage, because we can't go to these places. It's almost like you can't go to another planet either. We can't visit other planets. We can't visit the Triassic or the Jurassic. We have to imagine it. So in a sense, I sometimes think of it as like an oral history that we are handing down to each other. And we can be distracted sometimes by the fact that that's often owned by scientists and their scientific investigations, and it can feel remote, but actually it is essentially something that we share with each other. A fossil is only meaningful as a fossil to a person. It's not meaningful as a fossil to a bird or a tree, because it's just another piece of limestone. But to us, it means all sorts of other amazing, wonderful things, and it all starts inside our imagination. There was a poster, I think, about art. So apologies to everybody who's might be here who created that poster, and paleo art and things like that. Well, that was really interesting because I feel like the artistic process is something which is inherently important, or at least the basic creative urge is important in geology as a science, and it plays a massive role, I think, in advocating for it. Because if you think about a piece of paleo art that's recreating a scene from the Jurassic, that has to start inside somebody's head before it ends up on the page. And that whatever's in their head has come from somebody telling them about a skeletal fossil. And this was this, and this is what it used to look like. This is how it behaved. Oh, okay, I can put that on the page somehow and make it fun to look at. And in fact, the first piece of paleo art, one of the earliest pieces of paleo art, is something called Duria Antiquior, which is a more ancient Dorsetshire. And I urge you to just go and have a look at that sometime, because it's a Victorian piece of illustration, lovely ink and watercolor piece, and it's showing all these beasties interacting with each other. And it's supposedly the first attempt to visualize a Jurassic ecosystem with all of its inhabitants interacting with each other. It's great. I mean, in our immediate reaction is, oh, that's very scientific and lovely. But if you look at it, it is carnage. It's all these things like eating each other and pooing and blood and gore and guts and teeth and everything. It's basically Jurassic Park. So our relationship with the past and what we get from it has always been on that kind of, oh wow, this is so kind of amazing level. So the advocacy side definitely taps into that awe and wonder. But I'm more interested in, okay, what does that mean going forwards? So being advocates, so turning individuals into advocates is something I'm interested in. But like I say, it's a big challenge.
We're going to have to, we may have to sort of shift now. Sorry, guys. So now we'll have a bit of time for Andrew and I to say deep and interesting things, and then we'll have 5 minutes or so for more questions. So Andrew, go first.
lots and lots of waffle. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say. I'm going to start off actually by saying, because you guys can't see this, but this panel has got an amazing training. Yeah, completely irrelevant. Just one of those things. So where should I start? I think one of the things is there's someone kind of working in research around this area for quite a while. I had a whole panel and nobody talked about advocacy. And that's really actually quite refreshing. Really quite refreshing. It struck me that I think part of the reason for that is that a lot of the ideas that you're talking about around the environment kind of implicitly are quite critical of this idea that we have this epoch and that we can draw this line where suddenly humans are influencing the environment. So particularly, where I was talking about environments, this is something I do myself. I teach a module which is called Environments in Public for exactly this kind of reason, that in order to make sense of what environments are, it's relational, as Rose says, and once you make that move, then this whole idea of the environment or the Anthropocene kind of collapses. But then that raises the question of where you go next. And so Sam was talking about kind of sometimes once we start unpacking, so say the idea of naturalness, then people kind of go, oh, well, if it's not natural, then it doesn't matter. So where do we go? And then there was lots of stuff about imagined environments and then how we tell the story of environmental change, but in a way that again doesn't turn it into story making that doesn't matter. I have no particular answer on where that goes. That's just sort of a series of random observations for the conversation. I'm going to stop there.
All right. X is an environment if and only if the following three necessary and sufficient conditions are met. That's clearly a preposterous project, right? I seem to be doing something fundamentally wrong if I'm trying to provide a traditional philosophical conceptual analysis of the notion of environment. And I think there's something really interesting about why is that the case, right? Why is it that with some concepts we might want to provide, or at least attempt to do that, but the environment just seems like a non-starter. And I take it the idea is environment is like a really cool and clever bit of conceptual tech that is just this very fundamentally ambiguous way of kind of drawing circles around stuff and situating stuff in those circles. And there's something really useful about its ambiguity because it allows us to kind of communicate across a whole range of different contexts. But there's also a kind of danger with that as well, right? Because there's in order, John, there's a danger of reification with these extremely ambiguous concepts. We might start talking about the environment or acting as if when we're talking about the environment, which circle we've drawn and how we've situated ourselves or not in that circle is somehow obvious. And in fact, it never is. And it's the power is in its ambiguity. And we have to kind of, in some sense, keep that. And one of the big upshots, I think, is then when we start saying things like, I want to protect the environment, the question then is, well, what circle have you drawn and how are you situated within it? And why is that what you value, right? A lot of the discussions here were really about, here's this bit of the environment, here's how I value it. I think it's really important to be able to talk about the environment in a way that brings out that very contested, very relational feature of it. And so what's interesting is it's a really important, useful concept, and its usefulness is very much in its ambiguity and its messiness. And I think this whole discussion has illustrated this very well. I'll just say that. A couple of people wanted questions, so Ford's put his hand up and Philip's put his hand up. So Phil, you have a question or a comment or
well, thank you. It's mostly a comment rather than a question, but I think that one of the things that underlies all of your research is the question of whether or not there's what the naturalness actually consists of, and whether or not there's a balance of nature, which humans as a species are in the Anthropocene threatening to perturb, or whether it's just the anthropic principle, because because we are an intelligent species and capable of looking at these things, it's absolutely necessary that we've evolved in order to be able to look at these things. So it's not surprising, really, no matter how unlikely the events were, like the recovery from the great oxygenation event. It's necessary that it happened because otherwise we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be talking about it. So it seems like, and so that's what your former supervisor, Tim Linton, referred to as lucky guy versus probable guy. And I think that's really the question that you're sort of addressing, but not addressing really. So
I think in this context, if people want to respond, they can, but given the number of people who could respond, I think it's most interesting that people have comments and raise ideas, then we can talk about it after we have a photo taken.
So first of all, thank you very much. I want to go to one very important thing Melanie said and one very important thing that Arwen said. Melanie, I think you hit the nail right on the head when you talked about resistance to the kinds of changes at the kind of speed that are needed to avoid all sorts of horrible things probably happening to our descendants. I prefer to look at it, put it in probabilistic terms. And I think you were right to say, look, some of the things that are suggested are incredibly dangerous. So I have a question for you, Arwen. What do you think about Climeworks, the sort of sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere strategy? And I have a question for you, Melanie, which concerns the source of resistance. And what worries me about the discussion, especially in terms of advocacy, is the thought that if only we went out and talked to people and told them things, then they would agree, they would come to terms. And that isn't the case. And I want to suggest that in Britain and in the United States in particular, but in other countries to a lesser extent, the real problem comes from the fact that resistance is entirely reasonable. That is, people are very vulnerable. And they know their already precarious lives would be turned upside down if the things that Greta Thunberg wants them to do were actually done. And until you rebuild in the affluent world the kinds of protections for those people which have been stripped away in the last 4 decades, and until you respond to the needs of the developing world, the yearning for electrification in many, many parts of the world, until you start giving massive amounts of aid to make that possible in a sustainable way, I don't think the things that like community building and informing people are going to work. So this is a terribly pessimistic question or comment, but I mean, having been thinking about this problem for about the last couple of decades, that's where I've come at. I just don't, I mean, it's a lovely idea to do the kinds of advocacy that you're thinking about, but the times are more desperate than ever.
Sorry.
So we don't have time to answer that. So why don't we leave on a deeply pessimistic note? And so we can just embrace the chaos and go outside and have coffee after a photo. Thank you so much. This was a weird experiment. Everyone, you know.